Yes, I've been very interested in hallucinogenic experience and shamanism and that sort of thing since
Hmm.
the 60s. And what it has to do with time is, I think if you spend enough time looking at these things,
Hmm.
you come to see that the shamanic metaphor, the magical metaphor, are not as fully satisfying as thinking about these things in terms of dimensionality, that actually you do go into another dimension, not in the metaphorical sense, but in a sense that a mathematician would understand. It's
Would you say a literal sense?
a literal sense,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm. Now, many people who are very interested in dimensionality have been using all sorts of different ways, have been attracted to anywhere from the use of flotation tanks to all sorts of different kinds of tantric meditations from the Buddhists, from the Sufis, from the Kabbalists, and elsewhere. Now, maybe it would be interesting to hear your point of view on these, which are really post shamanic religious kinds of disciplines. And you have some points of view on it that would be nice to have
Well,
here.
I mean, the most practical point of view is whatever works for you, you should use.
Hmm.
If we then try to generalize to what works for most people, it seems to me the use of plant hallucinogens is particularly effective simply because it transcends ideology, it transcends ritual, it goes directly to the physical brain, and by perturbing uh, the living brain, it perturbs consciousness. And then out of that experience, conclusions are drawn within a cultural framework.
Hmm.
And so, an Aboriginal rainforest shaman may get one reading on that, and someone with training in quantum physics or something like that may reach a different conclusion. But the important thing of all these techniques, whether pharmacological or you mentioned Tantra, uh, is to perturb consciousness into insight about itself by
Hmm.
some means. And it's very tricky because consciousness is like a very heavy fluid. It always seems to seek the gravity of the familiar.
Hmm. Right. So, in a sense, what we're always struggling with or against is the tendency toward habituation. And one of the places we see that, of course, is mainly mental habituation. We
Yes.
think along the same lines, we think in the same linguistic patterns.
Well, an interesting thing about people is our tendency to habituate and addict to not only drugs and foods, but behavior patterns,
Sure.
ideologies,
Ideas.
routines. Uh, the founder of general systems theory, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, said once an amusing thing. He said, uh,
I would hope.
people are not machines, but in every situation in which they're given the chance to behave like machines, they will do so.
Oh, God. I think we have a society that proves that. The beehive mentality
Well,
Robert Anton Wilson refers to.
the problem is the power of media to co-opt people's ordinary impulses and to channel them along um, corporate or consumerist channels that are useful then not so much to the individual but to the organization that's doing the manipulating.
Sure. Absolutely. And that is no doubt one of the main reasons there has been such legislation on all levels, social as well as legal, about such things as hallucinogenic plants. Because, in fact, I think your life is very much testimony to that. When people ingest certain kinds of hallucinogens, the last thing they're thinking about is authority, consumerism, or legality for that matter.
Well, it isn't even so much that it neutralizes the consumerist impulses, it actually dissolves and erodes them because it sort of shows the the relativity of
Yes.
all existence. Consumerism is based on a strong reinforcement of ego, and ego is so easily relativized by the psychedelic experience that in some sense then the psychedelic experience is the enemy of the consumer society. And this makes for political dynamite, or at least interesting political rhetoric.
At least. Well, one of the things that really does happen with the psychedelic experience, as well as through such kind of simpler matters as contemplation and meditation, is people start to become cognizant of their lives, of their bodies, of the world around them, and the values that they're, in a sense, being asked to embrace through standard practices in the society. These no longer look very tasteful, I think, is one of the things that happens.
Yeah, I think you could, make a simple model of the psychedelic experience and say that what really happens is that you develop attention to attention. There's a pulling back. There's a second level of attention. And when you have that point of view, you are to some degree alienated because you're more aware of the ambiguity that haunts every situation. But on the other hand, you are more conscious. You're picking up on more of what the information that's actually being passed in the situation.
Yeah. Well, I think, I want everyone to know that Terence McKenna has written a number of books, one of which is, I happen to have with me, called The Archaic Revival. And there are numbers of others. True Hallucinations is the last.
True Hallucinations.
Invisible Landscape.
Invisible Landscape. Food of the Gods.
Food of the Gods.
I did one with the British biologist Rupert Sheldrake and Ralph Abraham, Trialogues at the Edge of the West. Which is a threefer. You get not only me, but two other pretty interesting guys.
What were those explorations like in that book?
We would have a dialogue, and then the third person would critique the dialogue. And these dialogues were on subjects like quantum physics, chaos theory, psychedelics, the millennium, the soul, just sort of things we thought were in the air that people might be interested in.
You're just reminding me of a weekend I spent with you a couple of years ago at the Open Center when you said something about the nature of science and how we've been, in a sense, scientifically programmed to value science on a belief system level, you would say, to think that it is really the be-all, end-all. But you made a very important point that's always really stuck with me, which is that there's one domain that science does not control for, but acts as though it controls for, and that's time. That time, you said, had a topography, that it had a shape to it, and that an experiment that is conducted on a Monday will not necessarily yield the same results on a Thursday afternoon.
Yes, well, you put your finger on a complex epistemological issue. Science, as we know it, uses probability theory as the fundamental mathematical tool. And how that works is you gather data, you put all the data together, you add it together, and then you average it. Well, this act of averaging has not been philosophically fully explored in terms of what its implications are. When you average a bunch of measurements, let's say, you smear out their individuality. And so behind the use of averaging and probability theory is the implicit assumption that it doesn't matter when the measurement was taken. In other words, in science, they say time is not a dependent variable. It's invariant. But that's just a guess.
Yeah.
We don't know that it's invariant. In our own experience, no love affair ever happens the same. No flu is quite like any other. No dinner is quite like any other.
Sure.
Our human world is filled with the unique felt presence of unique experience. But science gives us a world always based on these probabilistic generalities, which I think do great damage to the the subtle, fine structure of experience.
Well, if we just look at a lunar cycle, when we see that every single day is actually qualitatively and quantitatively different, that one day is never going to be the same by definition as another day.
Well, you could almost say, I suppose, that the scientist seeks what is similar between any 2 days, or bluebirds, or glaciers,
right.
And the poet seeks what is different. The artist seeks to celebrate the unique, and so they really represent two ends of a kind of spectrum.
Sure. I mean, each has its own value. But this isn't to negate the value of science. But sense,
science needs to undergo some pretty serious self-critiquing, because over the past 300 years or so, what has happened in science is, by concentrating on picking things apart, the idea of spirit, or a vital, unifying intellect, or a force, that all has been completely discredited by science. And it leaves you then with no basis for any ethic or anything. I mean, basically, people and animals are machines in this view. And if you believe that, you start treating them like machines, and you start putting machine-like politics in place, and it becomes nightmarish fairly quickly. So, and it's all right. I think science is coming along. It's a natural tendency of human beings to hit the easy problems first. And the easy problems are things like what's going on when a ball bearing rolls downhill, and what is water made out of. And the tricky problems
that one we haven't actually answered fully yet.
Well, no, but the really tricky problems are questions like what is memory? What is language?
What is existence?
Yeah. And so these questions are eventually going to be...
What is a magic mushroom?
What is a magic mushroom?
You have to answer that now.
Well, basically, any mushroom with psilocybin in it is pretty magical.
Well, you've described magic mushrooms as language.
They synergize, they catalyze language. They, probably as a footnote to the fact that they catalyze the imagination, they catalyze cognitive process. We don't know what that exactly means, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that cognitive process is definitely the name of the human game. So anything which catalyzes art, poetry, literature, mathematics, politics, music, it has major implications for the human enterprise. Of course, it's illegal, it's stigmatized, but these are simply local peculiarities of the folk.
Has nothing to do with the great longevity of time,
or the real meaning and implication of these things. I'm sure whatever work they do it whether they're scheduled or not.
Exactly. They're not going to be limited by local customs of the United States or European governments at this little point in time, which is but a blip on the screen. In fact, that's actually one of your great gifts to us all, Terence, which is for me, I really feel myself expand when I listen to you speak, because I give up all local notions of time. And it goes far beyond in each direction, by the way. Not just two, actually. It probably goes in more than that.
Not only when will it end, but when did we get here?
Yeah, really. You also talk about this transcendental object at the end of time.
Well, in an effort to understand novelty, where it's leading, you have to, if you extrapolate the notion, you have to realize it must lead to the most novel thing there is, that which there cannot be greater novelty than. So that's the transcendental object at the end of time. It's the light at the end of the tunnel, a kind of attractor of some sort. It's emerging. It's just, to take one example fairly close to home to most people, the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the internet is the most powerful and advanced technology ever put in place. It's arisen virtually in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
The world doesn't look substantially different. I mean, we didn't have to make highways or any of the things that other technologies have demanded,
Mm-hmm.
and yet really the nation state is now obsolete. So probably is the office as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
Corporations and nations haven't yet realized, but when they begin to understand how much money they can save through telecommuting and this sort of thing, the whole raison d'etre for clustering into enormous cities may just disappear. The other thing is, the internet is in a tremendous force for empowering the margins. All sexual minorities, all political minorities, all artistic minorities now can build very powerful communities on the internet and push their vision, whatever it is, forward. So traditionally, power to communicate and to control communication has been one of the most closely held prerogatives of the powerful. And now it's been given unto our hands. So I find that very exciting. I think that I haven't felt this kind of excitement with a new technology since the introduction of LSD.
Mm-hmm.
And there are similarities, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. Such as?
Well, both empower community. And the internet was largely created by people who were very much formed by that earlier revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the people who write VRML, the people who are putting Netscape and the new search engines and all this stuff out are freaks. I don't think they would balk at that label at all.
Mm-hmm.
They're people who love working in these areas because they represent the same kind of feeling of unlimited possibility that the psychedelic community had in the 60s.
Yeah. I'm just wondering about the internet. I've just been thinking about it and just getting involved in it myself, and would like to hear what you have to say about this, because the powerful have always, as you said, held a very close hand over media, and that's one of the ways they maintain their, even if somewhat false power, they still have that position. Is there a way of propagandizing the internet where a couple of powerful, or of the powerful, power possessing beings, as they're referred to, can usurp the general community feeling or community access?
I don't really think so. I mean, I think that what the internet is so fundamentally a different beast, and here's the distinction that I would make.
Mm-hmm.
For at least 200, maybe 300 years, Western civilization has been largely shaped by what is called mass media.
Mm-hmm.
Means, first of all, newspapers, and then all the electronic mass media.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of mass media is what's called one-to-many communication, where a letterman or somebody speaks and millions listen and emulate.
Mm-hmm.
The internet is what's called any-to-any communication.
Uh-huh.
You and I can have an email exchange, or I can send email to 1,000 people, or I can join a chat group of several hundred. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the changes are more profound than we can even imagine, because the mass media created two things which we cannot imagine living without: the idea of the public and the idea of the citizen. And now we hear a great deal about how society is dissolving into anarchy. What it means is there is no more public consensus. And that is because the electronic media personality isn't interested in following fads dictated from above in quite the same way. So instead, what we have is an incredibly heterogeneous and complex society that's all niches. There's no public anymore. There's just niches. The Latino niche, the lesbian niche, the this niche, the that niche. And there is no cohesion anymore. Well, some people think this is a terrible thing. I happen to think it's a very good thing because I think it makes us much more difficult to coerce and to control.
Yes.
So the ending of the age of mass media is something that the world corporate state has not really braced itself for because it has so much money invested in these now dinosaur forms of media.
Sure.
So I think of the internet really as a 60 million television channel, a 60 million channel TV.
Sure.
And naturally that creates, and it's a two-way deal.
Yeah, right. It's interactive.
I think the only way to deal with media and keep your wits about you is to produce it, not consume
to
it.
wit.
God forbid, do not consume it, and then do not flee it. That doesn't work either. The people say, well, I don't. Well, they're just, they're know-nothingism, even more easily manipulated. The key is to produce. And things like Photoshop and Macromind Director, and I don't work for any of these people, but I use their products, are incredibly empowering. What used to require $50,000 worth of production equipment can now be done with $3,000, and the cost is falling. That's got to be good for the spreading of countercultural and minority viewpoints and opinions.
Sure. That's a very, very good point. In fact, I was thinking about the internet in this respect a little bit very recently, and I was realizing it's in many ways, it's another way of putting it is it's a great equalizer. From a socioeconomic point of view, people who would never have anything to do with each other necessarily, would never cross paths, are being given an opportunity to meet via the net.
And it's safe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's safe. Yes, it creates a
people in absolutely distinct economic strata can come together.
Well, and no matter how minority your position, no matter how bizarre your interest, you can find a community of people on the internet absolutely
who share your
views and who are furiously advancing that agenda.
Yeah.
The other thing is, what the internet was designed for was research. And if you believe that information is power, then the information gathering research tool that has been given to the ordinary person to actually find out what the hell is really going on. I feel with my internet connection, I have better intelligence than Stansfield Turner had when he ran the CIA for Jimmy Carter. That's how fast these technologies. It's gone from what only the CIA director could have, that now sits on the desktop of millions of American homes.
Sure.
And what's that, 12 years or something like that.
So there's an incredible dispersion of information.
And acceleration of connectivity. Everybody's getting connected the way they wish. And of course, some of it is perverse and some of it is silly and trivial. But we had silly and perverse and trivial long before we had the internet.
Right. Yes. It didn't just all of a sudden arise, because people had a little desktop publishing computer on their desk. Right. Absolutely.